even just creating challenge in early life can have massive implications for neurobiology and behavior of animals. And so if they're going to experience stresses, which are inevitable, they're going to be transported, they're going to be mixed, there's going to be mating, there's all these sorts of things. If we can change the neurobiology to allow them to adapt better to those stresses, that may actually reduce that bucket being filled and overflowed.
Welcome to the Poultry Podcast Show. Today I'm here with Peta Taylor. Welcome to our show.
Hi, Elizabeth. Thanks for having me.
I'm very excited to chat with you today, but first I want to hear, how did you get into poultry?
I have a bit of a unconventional story getting into academia, let alone poultry. I was actually a really bad student in high school, and I had a lot of trouble. And after high school, I was quite lost, and I tried a lot of different jobs and did a bit of travel and did a bit of study. But it wasn't until I was 24 that I started to think about life and bigger questions. And one of those things was food production. And I grew up in the suburbs and I knew absolutely nothing about the food I was consuming. So as I started to look into it, something really resonated with me and got me motivated and excited to be part of that. And in particular, animal welfare of farm animals. So I followed that path and went back to university as a mature age student. And unlike my high school years, I just loved it. I loved learning. I loved everything about it. So I don't know, just was in the right frame of mind, studying the right thing. And I loved science. And I had great university lecturers. So I found studying quite easy and I was extremely dedicated. So it was my third year that I came across Paul Hemsworth's work and animal welfare science. And I thought, oh my goodness, bringing data to the discussion about how we treat animals. And that to me was very clear that that's where I wanted to work in and spend my life. Not necessarily with chickens, actually. So I wrote to Paul Hemsworth. I sent him quite a few emails and I never got a response. So I kept moving. I kept working towards that goal. I did my honours at La Trobe University and I did it in a muscle biochemistry lab with a group of amazing researchers, but they were working on muscular dystrophy and human health. And I was the one who was interested in animals. And so I was working with Robin Murphy's lab and we had a colony of dunnarts, which are a marsupial, Australian marsupial. They look like a little mouse. They're very cute. You could Google them maybe. And they're fat-tailed dunnarts, so they store fat in their tail. And I thought, you know what, they're here. We've got a colony of them. Let's do something with them. And we looked at, biochemistry, leptin, insulin, skeletal muscle properties. But then also I had a supervisor, Dr. Richard Peters, who brought in the animal behavior side of things. And even though it wasn't farm animals, it was this pairing of physiology and behavior to understand the welfare of that animal. And I think I've really carried those learnings with me throughout my career and my PhD. So I was still trying to contact Paul Hemsworth during this time. And, there was a seminar scheduled at La Trobe University that Paul was going to speak at. And I thought, this is my opportunity. And so I went and he didn't turn up. And so I think he was ill. So he sent one of his new research fellows, Jean-Loup Rolt. And that's where I met Jean-Loup and approached him and said, I'm really passionate about animal welfare for particularly farm animals. I want to do a PhD. And he said, great. Yeah, we have a project with chickens. And I sort of was quite disappointed. I was like, no, chickens. And he said, actually, they're broiler chickens. And I thought, oh, no, not even the good chicken. And, I was so wrong. It turned out that was like one of the best decisions, because as soon as I learned about the industry, as soon as I learned about the chickens themselves, I just fell in love and haven't looked back. I think in particular, the meat chickens, coming from that physiology and behavior perspective, their morphology and their physiology is just so unique and extremely interesting. And then also my perception about what I thought they should be doing and how they should be behaving, because they look like adults, was quite a challenge to remember that they're actually chicks. And, they would be spending time with their mother hen at that age. So I think that was a really great experience to sort of drop my assumptions and collect the data and listen to what the animal's actually saying. So I never grew up thinking I want to work with chickens, but I'm so grateful and so thankful for that turn of events in my life.
That definitely is unconventional, but also really, really interesting path to working on your doctorate.
Natural Biologics is using cutting-edge science to dig deeper into the poultry health challenges you face. By gathering scientific evidence, they identify the most effective combinations of natural ingredients that improve animal health. Visit naturalbiologics.com/poultry to see the newest research in both turkeys and chickens.
So between finishing your degree and the career you have now, what was the series of events that led you into academia?
I have been extremely lucky, actually. Right place, right time, right connections. So when I was finishing up my PhD, I hadn't quite finished. I was writing my thesis, and a lecturing position in animal behaviour and welfare was advertised in New South Wales, which is the state next to where I live. So it's about 14 and a half hours drive. And I rang and I said, I'm so interested in this position. And they said, you're probably not qualified yet. You haven't finished your PhD. And I thought, fair enough. And I was just encouraged just to apply, like it's going to be a great experience. And of course it was, but I actually ended up getting the job. And so, I don't know, maybe I was really relaxed because I thought I'm not going to get this, but I enjoyed the process and I really enjoyed talking about animal welfare science with a new group of people. So I moved to Armidale with my partner and my dogs, and we lived up there for 6 years and at the University of New England. And they had a very strong poultry program up there as well. So I was really surrounded by poultry nutritionists and geneticists. And yeah, it was quite an exciting time. And then I had a child, and being during that time, it was COVID and my family were away, and I missed home, and part of me really missed the Animal Welfare Science Centre as well, which they were still working with them at the time, and an opportunity came up. Again, just great timing. I was ready to leave the University of New England, and Melbourne University advertised a lecturing position for a lecturer in animal science, not just focused on animal welfare. And again, I thought I probably don't have much of a chance of this, but I'll just have a go. And I got the position. So I think I knew people. I was, I guess, brave in a sense and a bit naive and just had a go. So I think when a lot of people say, I'm not sure if I should, you never know what's going to come of it. So a bit of luck. And I say that, but also, you're an academic, just damn hard work, long hours, publishing, building connections. But yeah, mostly luck.
That's amazing to have back-to-back wins like that. Like, I love hearing
Unheard of. I
those
think I've
success
used up
stories.
all my luck. So
No. Ah, so can you tell us a little bit about the area that you're working in right now with poultry welfare and some of the topics that are intriguing for you right now, like the areas that you kind of like to hang your hat on, if you will?
yeah, I think I'm everything about poultry welfare excites me. I work with laying hens, but my heart is still with meat chicken welfare. But there's some really interesting work we're doing. I've just finished up some projects looking at the use of maternal calls on altering behavior of meat chickens and improving welfare, and finishing up some work with free range use. How do we optimize them to meat chickens to use the range? But two really interesting projects I'm kind of working on at the moment that has me and my colleagues really scratching our heads as some abnormal behaviors. So we're working on piling and smothering in laying hens. I think traditionally we know piling and smothering as these fear responses, a panic smother or a nest box smother. But this really strange recurring smothering or creeping smothering is sort of becoming more and more common, where the birds are just really motivated to press together for can be long periods of time. We've observed for 5 minutes, we've observed an hour and a half of these birds, almost just like a mosh pit. And to the point, it's so bizarre, and they're just not moving away as you would think a normal behavior would be, and to the point where, producers are losing hundreds of birds in one event. And it seems that they pile really frequently, but smothering happens infrequently. So we're trying to look at why the heck do they actually do this behavior, and then also what makes a pile risky to become a smothering event. So these abnormal behaviors are quite intriguing. We're trying to get inside the animals' heads. The other one we're looking at the moment is feather licking in broiler breeders. And in Australia, we typically have been calling that feather sucking, but I'm trying to change that to feather licking to be more globally consistent, but also anatomically birds can't suck. So it's not feather pecking. It's not feather eating. We think that's to do with nutritional deficiencies. It's that they're simply licking the feather of a conspecific, and we're seeing chains of birds like licking each other, or two birds licking each other on the other side. And it seems to be this non-functional behavior that just spreads throughout the flock.
So how does that behavior start? And is it more often seen in the meat birds or in layers, or both? Because, how do you learn that? Or how do you start it?
Yeah, I've not heard of it with laying hens. I've not heard of it in growing meat chickens. For me, it's something that we've been having conversations with industry, particularly in Australia, about this occurring and perhaps occurring more frequently in breeders, in meat chicken breeders. And it seems to happen predominantly in rearing, not so much in production. And it seems to occur around 7 to 12 weeks of age. So we don't know a lot about it at the moment. We've done some surveys with industry and international poultry welfare scientists, but we have cameras installed in 8 sheds at the moment, just trying to watch how this starts and how it spreads. And I think importantly, what happens from that, what are the consequences? So there are some concerns with industry that this is actually where severe feather pecking and cannibalism can actually start. Some others feel that it's maybe not so much detrimental in that sense, but it may wear down the feathers, and then females are more likely to get damage from mating later in life if they've had their feathers sucked. And of course, when I think about that time frame, it's usually when feed restriction is most severe in our breeders. And so, oral stereotypies are rather common in animals that are feed restricted. We see it with wool biting, with sheep that are feed restricted, or barb biting from sows that are feed restricted. So it could actually be an oral stereotypy. And that would kind of make sense, I suppose. It's not every flock, and it seems to be so random and unpredictable. So it may just be this, bucket of stress where this flock has this one extra thing that spreads into feather sucking as a coping mechanism. And one of our industry partners says he seems to think it's like sucking your thumb, it's just a soothing thing, and then it becomes a habit.
Yeah. Because I sort of imagine it's not a mutual grooming. It's different than that, right? Because you see preening or that sort of behavior, but this is the word, it's more destructive, or it's more like a stress behavior, sort of like what you mentioned.
It's really hard to say. It doesn't seem to be aversive for the chicken that's receiving it, because they're not moving away. Oh,
right.
Yeah, so if they're pulling out the feathers, the conspecific that's receiving it is moving away. But the fact that they're sort of in groups sometimes, it looks very different than preening. Preening seems to be a bit of a faster, rapid movement, and this is like almost, if you can imagine, like a chip or a fry, maybe a French fry, and just this elongated movement of their beak. And that's kind of the first step. We were looking at providing environmental enrichment to reduce this behavior. We thought maybe it's boredom, or doesn't matter why they're doing it. If the outcome is poor for welfare, can we redirect it? And before we put some things in the shed, we just said we need to know more about what this behavior actually looks like. So at the moment, we are trying to get a really detailed ethogram around this, because at the moment, I think when we're talking to a lot of producers, we're getting confused about feather eating, feather sucking, and feather pecking. So I think those definitions are really important. But the other interesting thing is it all seems to start around the base of the tail.
Oh, interesting.
So there's another really cool hypothesis that I would love to continue working to answer is maybe if they are feed restricted, maybe they're trying to gain access to the preen gland secretions. Maybe there's something that's tasty. And, the composition of those preen gland secretions differ between individuals. Maybe that's why we see some getting sucked and some not. So we really don't know, but it is a bizarre behavior and just really unpredictable.
Probiotech International is driven by innovation, inspired by nature, and passionate about contributing to a more sustainable, safe, and healthy food system. We work closely with our customers to deliver solutions to current and future challenges facing the animal production sector while using natural active ingredients such as chemotypes and polyphenols derived from plant extracts and spices. Our products follow a rigorous scientific validation process. They are then proven to work through thorough field research, certified for quality, and then brought to market as a complete and effective solution. In a world filled with rapid change, let Probiotech International deliver your opportunities for solutions and savings to your program. Innovation is in our nature. Visit probiotech.com/EN for more information.
I think having cameras up will give you a lot of information, but perhaps the hardest part is for research. To have a model to study would be the hardest part about this. You have to wait till you see it, right? At least now to describe it. But then in order to create a situation, if you want to learn how to stop the behavior, you have to have a model. So that, man,
Exactly. And we've sort of, as well as putting cameras up and crossing our fingers and hoping that we see it, we're also doing a sort of a epidemiological approach. And this really mimics something we've just finished in the Animal Welfare Science Centre with piling and smothering, because again, that's really unpredictable. So we do a survey of flocks across across a couple of countries at the moment, and just ask producers to comment on the bird's behaviour, comment on the feather cover, and then list environmental factors and other potential stresses that are going on, so that we can at least pull down some of these risk factors and say, well, this seems to be really important. It is around feed restriction or a potential stressor or something else that was occurring. So you're right. So we can then build hypotheses around that and maybe try and initiate that behavior.
Yeah. So you mentioned that one of the potential methods to either reduce or change some of these behaviors is environmental enrichment. So what have you what are your favorite enrichments, or maybe you don't have a favorite? What have you been trying? So I know there's so many options, and I love to hear what people think about different options.
Yeah, this is a huge space, and I think there's a lot of potential for environmental enrichment with breeders, just in general. Really, I think particularly in Australia, there's not a lot of regulations around it. People are doing different things that they may be not supported by science. There's been no investigation there, so people have trial and error, crossing fingers. But we know that effective environmental enrichment can be so good for animal welfare in a variety of ways. And we looked at things like pecking devices, because it is that sort of oral behavior. Even something that's novel in their environment that doesn't have to be biologically relevant. Now, that's really tricky to do, because producers don't have a lot of time to put out something novel and then pack it up and disinfect it and clean it and put something out 3 days later. Yeah. We know that works. So it's what we found talking to producers is that a lot of what's in the literature doesn't align with what's happening on farm. And when we looked into this a little further, we said, well, why is that? And well, there's biosecurity risks why they don't use this particular thing, or it's really hard to dispose of that with their waste system, or this is unavailable in the density that they require. So to me, over the last few years, looking at what are effective environmental enrichments that reduce stresses or redirect abnormal behaviors, or provide pleasure, all of those reasons why we give environmental enrichment, it doesn't seem to align with what's happening in industry. And I think there's a disconnect about, okay, I'm going to design, I'm going to look at this, what's actually practical to implement. So we've been really lucky with the industry in Australia, who have been really open and welcoming. And 12 months ago, I hadn't been inside a breeder shed, and everyone is opening the doors and saying, come in, what can we do? This is what we try. And I think that's a good way to find solutions for these things. So I think we're at the point now where we've got enough information about the potential practical considerations we need to have, and then moving forward, what those environmental enrichments would look like. And so if I was to choose, I didn't quite answer your question, but if I was to choose something to enrich their environment, I think I would target rearing. Rearing can be relatively, it's quite consistent. There's not a lot of change. And I think besides reducing things like boredom or frustration, or, giving them something to forage towards if they're hungry, to sort of appease that motivation in some way, even just creating challenge in early life can have massive implications for neurobiology and behavior of animals. And so if they're going to experience stresses which are inevitable, they're going to be transported, they're going to be mixed, there's going to be mating, there's all these sorts of things. If we can change the neurobiology to allow them to adapt better to those stresses, that may actually reduce that bucket being filled and overflowed, and, assuming this is a stereotypy. But I think there'd be consequences for production as well, if you're reducing these stresses and allowing them to cope better. So exactly what that would look like, I don't know, but I think, novelty and increasing agency in early life would be really important.
Yeah. So you also mentioned some of your ideas around welfare and some of the pastured formats of raising birds. So what are the pros and cons about that system, since all of the systems have things about them that make them easy or difficult, but what kind of work have you done in that area?
Yeah, so my PhD was looking at range use of meat chickens and the relationship with welfare. So it wasn't that I was comparing other systems, barn reared, to that, but rather what are the differences or the benefits of those birds that choose to range versus those that don't within a free range system. And I think that's really cool because we could actually isolate that part that makes it different. And we used radio frequency identification technology. So, same when you go shopping, the chickens just had a little tag, and they walked, every time they walked out of the pop holes, we knew what direction they were going. We could say, well, this chicken went out at this time for this period of time. And at that time, it was really cool because we would take photos prior to that and say, well, 10% of the flock actually use the range, which can be quite concerning to consumers as well, who, when they're buying free range products, they want their bird to have gone out on the range. So by individually tracking, we could see that 10% at one time is using it, but they're actually rotating throughout the day.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So in our Australian summer down south, 80% of the flock were using the range. But in winter down here, only 30% of the flock were using the range. Of course, it's such a short period of time for meat chickens. It's so different than free range laying hens. So we were also able to look at the other good thing is, they're out there for a short period of time. You can do pre and post measures quite easily and quickly. So we did that, and we looked at indicators of fearfulness, thinking maybe chickens that are more fearful won't go out and use the range. So what we found was the fear didn't dictate who was going to use the range, but after using the range, the birds that went out more frequently and further from the shed, they were able to deal with challenges better. So they had a reduced fear response. They had a lowered physiological stress response when we captured them and held them. So this awesome benefit of going out to this complex range environment actually meant that they could deal with stresses better later in life. We also found that they had better leg health and better cardiovascular function as well. But these are relationships. So maybe those that are active with better cardiovascular function and better leg health are actually utilizing the range. Yeah. But it is interesting. It's quite clear, I think, with meat chickens that there are benefits to using the range, health benefits, as well as we know that choice is important for animals. So I guess there's some of the positives that we've quantified. I haven't looked into disease, but, we all know at the moment there are avian influenza concerns, and it's hard to keep free range, birds isolated from wild birds and some of these risks. So, but at least we know that there are valid scientific evidence that there are benefits to birds having access to the range when they use it.
Yeah, it's super interesting that you found the kind of the distribution of birds who were using it. It just happened to be at different times. So maybe maybe just like humans, we've got birds that are early risers and then some that kind of want to hang out for a little while till they're ready to go outside.
100%, 100%. We were just looking at, following on from my PhD work, we looked at how do we optimize range use because, as I said, there is this consumer pressure of what they perceive free range to be. And, it's, as a welfare scientist, if the choice is real, you think that's what's important. I would take me and my sister, if we were chickens, she would be waiting for that pop hole to open and she would be out running and I would be sitting by that feed pan and not wanting to move. There are individual differences in these animals. So we didn't want to push out birds that don't want to be there just to meet consumer expectations or, those positive welfare components that we've assessed may be compromised if we're pushing birds out where they don't want to be. And it is quite difficult for consumers who don't know a lot about chickens. They think, oh, what a beautiful green grass with bright, beautiful sunny sky. And that's not what birds want. They don't like a high, UV index, and they like those lovely cloudy days. Yeah. So we didn't want to push them out. But what we did was we actually gave them transparent pop holes. And so from day old, they could actually see out onto the range. And when it came to day 21, which is when they're given range access in Australia, in both controlled and commercial conditions, there were a lot more birds that went out quickly onto the range if they could see it from day old. So that was a nice way to encourage them without pushing them. But still, they still had those Peta Taylor birds that were sitting by the feed pan and saying, no, thank you.
They're going to wait for the auger to turn on so they can get the fresh feed.
That's right. That's right. Each to their own.
Oh, my gosh. So what are some of, just forward thinking, what are some of the topics that you are investigating now or some things that you're kind of interested to move into in the future? Maybe because there's not a model or just maybe because the state of welfare right now, it can be difficult from a research standpoint to make it conclusive, like this is the outcome. So like where does research need to go to get better at understanding the animals that we study?
That's a good question. That's a big question.
It is.
There is just so much we don't know, I think. And, trying to understand an animal's perspective and the subjective experience is so hard. So there is some really fundamental work that needs to be completed and supported, which is really hard to get funding for because everyone wants to see the application. We don't know where that might lead, but I think some of those fundamentals are really important. But also from our experience, we particularly at UNE, we had these beautiful facilities for chickens and including free range facilities. And I think that's a really nice way to start in small group sizes where you can control everything. But then ultimately you have to have commercial partners where you can then take that and say, is this actually applicable on farm?
Yeah.
And so I think it takes longer and it's more expensive, but they're the sort of, as you say, these evidence-based information or decisions we can make from that. And we've just finished some work using maternal calls with meat chickens.
Oh, yeah.
The idea was that we would play these feed calls when they arrived and they would go to the feeder and get on feed quicker after transportation at day old. And we know that the quicker they get on feed, the better feed conversion ratio, growth rate, and gut health and welfare. So that was the aim, but they didn't go. So we couldn't change their behaviour. They were like kids, not listening to their mother. But what we did find is that they were listening. Even though we couldn't change their immediate behavioral response, we found evidence that there was changes in their neurobiology, specifically related to stress responses. And we also found that when we challenged them at 8 days of age, they showed less signs of sort of anxiety-like behaviours when we challenged them. And so there's some evidence here that there may be this sort of stress ameliorating effects of providing a mother hen call. So that's really cool. We did this in controlled settings. But again, what does that actually mean for industry? So that's where I think, you know, we've invested in this. We've got this little bit of evidence to suggest this is potentially really beneficial for the birds in industry. Now we need to go into those commercial conditions. That's harder to do research, and there's more variables and harder to control, but it's real life. So what happens if we play, you know, maternal calls during transportation? And that's where I think I haven't quite answered your question. It was big. I brought it back to where I want our research to go, but ultimately I think that's the way that research needs to happen. You know, do these fundamental questions, do the controlled studies, and then ultimately out into commercial conditions.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect answer. That's a good. It ultimately ends with relevance that could affect more birds than just a research flock.
100%. I mean, that's the whole point of doing this research, isn't it? I mean, I'm incredibly interested in what a bird thinks and how it feels for that in its sake. But, you know, this is all about making change in industry, making lives better for chickens and producers, and making things streamlined and easier and more ethical and sustainable. So, 100%.
So when you were playing those mother hen calls, I'm assuming you were either videoing or observing the chicks, but were they looking for the hen? You know what I mean? Did they all like just look up and stop what they were doing? Or was it more like, I acknowledge you, but I'm not going to listen?
Yeah, good question. We actually started with, again, some of these fundamental questions that maybe weren't the most interesting, but, you know, do we need to put the speaker behind the feeder, or can we actually just put it on the roof? Because if you're thinking about eventually putting this in industry, you're going to have to put a speaker on every single feed pan compared to two on the roof. So that was one of the first questions. And we didn't find a difference. I think when we played noise, we also had our control had white noise. So it wasn't that they just weren't, interrupted. When they hear it, they freeze, as chickens tend to do, and go, what the heck? And but no response. And in fact, the other application we wanted for this is we wanted to use a cluck call or a roost call. So these are the sort of calls that mother hens would say, you know, come here and keep you safe, or, you know. And I wanted to use this in a free range system because in lots of areas in Australia, the weather gets so hot in the afternoon or midday that the birds that are outside are fine, but because our tunnel ventilation, the pop holes are all open, the birds inside are at risk of heat stress. So for most days in the summer in areas like South Australia, at around 11 a.m., the birds have been out since 4 a.m., but they need to get the birds back in. And there is a range of methods I've seen producers use to do this. They might walk along with a loud stick trying to get them in, or quad bikes, or, they're frightening the birds back in for a start. It's probably not great for the birds, but also it's so time consuming. You've got 12 double-sided sheds. You've got to do that. So we thought, well, let's put up a speaker and get mother hen to like call them back in the range. And the first day we tried it to both white noise and maternal calls, the birds ran inside. I think they were just like, what the heck is that? And they ran inside.
Trouble.
Yeah, exactly. And then the second day, they sort of popped their head up and looked vigilant and said, nah, that's okay. By the third day, they didn't even respond. So I guess like all children, they don't listen to their mother. Well, no, they're listening. They're listening. We can tell that from
Yeah.
the, neurobiology and their, responses to stress. But yeah, you can't tell them what to do, I'm afraid. Certainly not in the
Yeah.
circumstances and the situation that we trialed. But there's so many different calls and there's so many different contexts that, there's a couple of people working in this space. I think there's just a huge amount of possibility that, these maternal calls. And once you put a speaker up, you have the opportunity of playing a lot of different calls in a lot of different contexts. So it'd be cool to see some more work in that space.
Oh gosh, that is too funny that they acclimated that quickly. Like day one was, I'm listening to that alarm.
Yeah.
Then, just kidding. It's like the boy who cried wolf. Those birds learned really quickly they would rather be outside and they were not going to go inside.
That's right. That's right. Maybe we need to have some sort of reward when they come in. They get a little mealworm or something to say, good job. You responded.
You did it.
Yeah.
Clicker training. That could be your next.
100%. And we do that with all of our students that come through both at UNE and Melbourne Uni here with chickens, and it has a massive effect on the people. But I would love to see that done with a bird, a flock of 45,000 birds. That would be quite the sight.
Oh yeah, I mean, because the at least that I've seen in our commercial facilities, I just have to assume it's the same. But when they hear that auger click on and they hear the pellets coming out, they are booking it because they're going to the fresh feed.
That's it. If you add a mealworm to that mix, then you're
very motivational. But the mealworm could be a little too motivational. We certainly wouldn't want a piling event, if they were
exactly. Yeah.
Well, I think our discussion today has been really fun and educational. Is there anything about any of the topics that we addressed today that you wanted to highlight or had any other comments to make about them?
I don't think so. I mean, I could talk forever about poultry welfare, and you've done some great work yourself in environmental enrichment and lasers, and I think that's a great space. I listen to this podcast a lot. Environmental enrichment is something I'd love to hear more about, because often I hear that it's anthropomorphic and there's no benefit. And I think that's because some of the things we use are actually pseudo enrichment. So to keep that conversation going and making sure that whatever producers are spending their time and their money on are actually beneficial for them and the birds, I think is really cool. But don't ask me that question. We could be here for another hour.
That's a sign that you really like your job, so it's good.
So lucky. Love it.
It's time for our famous three. Evonik Animal Nutrition is committed to ensure food security and safety while reducing the ecological footprint of animal farming. Its products and services use evidence-based solutions that seek to promote animal welfare and reduce reliance on natural resources. All this is underpinned by long-standing industry partnerships and deep customer understanding. Evonik's focus on efficiency, sustainable, healthy nutrition, and collaborations with livestock farming partners creates value for customers and consumers.
So to wrap up our chat today, I'm going to ask the questions that we ask all of our guests. So the first one is, do you have a favorite poultry-related resource or a manual that you reference?
Yes, I have a lot. But I think my number one, just because it's got a heap of information in an incredibly easy to digest way, is the Behavioral Biology of Chickens by Christine Nicole, which I'm sure everyone who comes on this podcast has said at one point.
I don't think I've heard that one yet, which is it's so great because you're introduced to, kind of big big picture books or other references for each person's specific field. So no, it's a good one. The second question is, do you have a favorite non-poultry book or resource?
Yeah. A book, I would think there's an animal welfare book by Mike Appleby and colleagues. And the third edition in particular, I'm being very specific, the third edition is amazing. It's just, it goes from the, welfare impacts of agency and, international perspectives, as well as, different ethical perspectives. I think it's a really great resource. But and podcasts, I listened to 2 podcasts on my way to poultry farms, this one obviously being one. Yeah, and the other one is All in the Mind, which is an Australian ABC podcast, really about neuroscience and with humans and animals. So that's a really cool resource as well.
Yeah. Ooh, that's a good one. I always love hearing about new podcasts to dabble in. The last question to wrap up our chat is, what is your best advice for somebody to be successful in the poultry industry?
That's a good one. So I guess I work with the poultry industry. I'm in academia, so I don't know if it's different. I could probably speak from my perspective. And as you said before, I must love my job. I do. I think academia is one of the best jobs you can have. You get to ask questions all of the time. But maybe one of the hardest parts is you are constantly getting scrutinized. And I think that makes you a better scientist. I think it makes your science more applicable and real world. So if I was to give advice about someone who wants to work in academia with the poultry industry, then to frame feedback as an opportunity rather than a criticism. And that's not to say you have to take on board everything that somebody tells you, but to be able to remove yourself and an ego, I guess, and really question, is this right? Have I done that right? Could this work differently? That's it's hard to get feedback, but I think to be a great scientist and to make real change, then that's something that would be extremely beneficial.
Yeah, you cannot be a good scientist without knowing and learning and being comfortable with any sort of feedback. It is I'll say at the risk of using the word incorrectly, but it's got to be a learned behavior, right? You don't just you don't just start out being really good at accepting criticism. You got to learn.
100%. And it's not personal. I think that's if I took everything personally each time, which is hard when you love what you do and you're really passionate about it, but you wouldn't last too long. You'd be crushed.
I'm on board with you. Well, thank you so much for chatting with me today. I love talking to ethologists, and I always, again, learn something new. So I definitely have a greater appreciation for how quickly birds learn to ignore us humans and the silly things we're doing that they might not find relevant.
I've had a great time, and it's really nice. I've listened to your podcast with some incredible guests for a long time. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely welcome.